We're back with another episode of App Stories. This week's episode, a very special OS preview episode, is sponsored by our summer OS preview series sponsor, Concepts, Collide, SourceGraph, and Memberful. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Vitici. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing really well. You and I have a lot of features and details and things floating around in our brains, and it's time to dump them all out.
To drop some knowledge.
We've already dropped it into a text editor, so let's start dropping it into a microphone because we've got a lot to talk about today. We've got iOS 16, iPadOS 16, and macOS Ventura. And we're going to tackle this. That's a lot of ground to cover, but I think we're going to tackle this by having you first talk about some of the features of iOS 16 and iPadOS 16 that are unique to those platforms, then talk together about some of the system apps because there's a lot in common that overlaps between the Mac and those other platforms, and then I'll talk and finish up a little bit more about Ventura.
Yeah. So for context, the public betas, as John mentioned, of iOS, iPadOS, macOS Ventura, and watchOS 9, I have no idea about tvOS, honestly. I suppose there's also a tvOS public beta, but I don't know.
Not many changes.
These 4 public betas are available today, right now. We are going to have 3 articles about iOS and iPadOS by me, macOS by John, and watchOS 9 by Alex on Mac Stories. But there's also this episode where John and I are recapping the 3 OSs we individually covered with articles on the site. We're also going to talk about them on the show. So I figured I would start with iOS. Now, iOS 16, I'll be honest with you, John. I've in the past month, I've spent more time thinking about and using iPadOS than iOS. And I think for obvious reasons, right? There's a big change, which is Stage Manager, brand new multitasking on iPadOS, external display integration, all the desktop class features. Obviously, and also going into WWDC with the MacBook Pro story that I wrote, iPadOS is a massive change. And so over the past month, I've spent even thinking about iPadOS more than iOS. But in iOS 16, I think there's still a few highlights that I really want to cover. And one of them, I think, is the feature of iOS 16, obviously, the brand new lock screen. We talked about this in our preview series for WWDC last month. iOS 16 features an entirely new and customizable lock screen. And Apple, with this feature, is building, I think, on top of the theme of user customization and personalization that they first introduced 2 years ago in iOS 14 with home screen widgets. And after the massive success and popularity of home screen widgets, we all sort of thought, oh, obviously Apple is going to follow up to this in iOS 15 with more customization, but they didn't. And instead, they're back after 2 years with widgets on another area of the system, which is the lock screen. But the thing is, the lock screen in iOS, it's not just about the widgets. And I think Apple is telling this new sort of cohesive story about personalization and the lock screen as part of this bigger narrative that combines the lock screen with the home screen, focus modes, and maybe even watch faces on the Apple Watch as this single sort of idea of user customization that can follow you around throughout the day and switch between multiple modes. So the lock screen, the idea is you can now create multiple lock screens. Just like you can have multiple watch faces on your Apple Watch, you can now have multiple lock screens on your iPhone. These lock screens, you can customize each with a different wallpaper and with a different set of widgets. Widgets are different from the home screen widgets you may be used to, place on your home screen. They have different layouts and they have a different design. In fact, these are really reminiscent of watchOS complications. If anything, they are complications because in watchOS 9 and iOS 16, the technology underlying complications on watchOS 9 and lock screen widgets in iOS 16 is the same one. It's WidgetKit.
Right. And the design of them is identical, really, because you've got the circular ones and then you've got kind of the rounded rect ones as well.
Exactly. You have the same design with this you have three types of widgets. You have a small inline widget, you have the rectangular widget, and you have the small circular ones.
Right. This episode of App Stories and all of Mac Stories' Summer OS Preview series is brought to you by Concepts, the Infinite Canvas app for iPad. Sketch, explore, and share ideas with Concepts Infinite Canvas for iPad. Designed for creators of all types, the app is ideal for visual thinking, note-taking, drawing, and professional design. Concepts lets you interact with and edit your sketches, helping you to think and draw smarter. As everything you draw is a vector, you can move, edit, and organize your sketches after you draw them using natural gestures. Sketch freely with liquid pens, markers, and brushes in designer Copic colors. Create mood boards with images, PDFs, and objects, then draw on top. Design with tools like grids, snap, and real-world measurements to create professional projects. Connect your device to any display for instant whiteboarding with a built-in presentation mode. Concepts is used by designers and illustrators at Apple, Disney, PlayStation, Unity, and other companies globally to sketch, design, and communicate visually. Concepts comes with the free basic sketching app, with the ability to unlock features via a subscription or one-time payment. To learn more, visit their website at concepts.app, and Mac Stories readers and listeners of this show can enjoy a special 3-month extended free trial when they sign up for an annual subscription. Take advantage of this deal today by going to concepts.app/MacStories. Again, that URL is concepts.app/MacStories. Our thanks to Concepts for their support of the show.
Now, the idea is that in addition to placing widgets in these two distinct areas, above the clock and underneath the clock, you can also customize the clock itself. Obviously, that's the central element of the lock screen, and it's not going away. Instead, what you can do is you can choose between, as of right now, 10 different fonts for the system clock, and you can also use any color you want. Once you enter lock screen customization mode, you can do so by long pressing on the lock screen, entering the lock screen gallery UI, and then choosing the lock screen you want to customize. You can just tap on the system clock, and you will bring up this new menu that has a font picker and a color picker. And you can choose between built-in color palettes made by Apple, but there's also a color picker. So the system color picker, so you can choose whatever color you want. And these 10 font options combined with really infinite colors, it grants you a ton of freedom in terms of designing the kind of lock screen that you want to have. Maybe you want to have a more friendly, curved, rounded font with a pink color. You can do that. You want to have a classic thin font with a more neutral color like white or light gray. You can also do that. There's also a thick serif font that you can maybe combine with a red color. You can do whatever you want. So these two elements, the widgets and the system clock, they sort of play with each other in terms of the tint that you use and obviously, the font that you choose for the clock. And on top of all this, you can choose your wallpaper. And I mean, obviously you can choose your wallpaper. You've always been able to choose
right.
a wallpaper. But what's different now is that there's a new wallpaper gallery. And this gallery includes a lot of new built-in wallpapers made by Apple, organized in categories. You have your solid color wallpapers. You have gradient wallpapers. You have astronomy wallpapers with 3D images of the planet Earth and the moon. And there's multiple variations for each. There's a solar system wallpaper. There's a live weather wallpaper. There's a Pride and Unity wallpapers. There's emoji wallpapers. So you can craft these unique emoji wallpapers with a combination of emoji in different geometric patterns. And then you can use a background color and you can put together some either beautiful or just disgusting creations depending on the emoji that you use. But what's also interesting, and I want to hear what you think about this, John, is I've never really been a photo wallpaper person myself. I've never really used photos as my wallpapers, either on the lock screen, on the home or the home screen. just because for work purposes, I take a lot of screenshots, and I prefer to take those screenshots with a more muted, neutral color background. But in iOS 16, there's this new wallpaper mode called Photo Shuffle that I think is really interesting. So the Photo Shuffle, it lets you shuffle through a selection of photos as your lock screen wallpapers in a couple of different ways. You can either manually select, say, 20 photos or 30 photos from your library, and you can say, shuffle through these photos, I don't know, every hour or every day or whenever I wake my iPhone. And the system does that. Or you can trust iOS 16 because the system analyzes your photo library, and the information that it finds for people, pets, nature, and cities, you can choose one of those categories to say, shuffle through photos of your dogs, or shuffle through photos of your kids or your partner, or shuffle through photos of cities around the world that you took with your iPhone. And as I said, I've never really been a photo wallpaper person myself, but this feature, the Photo Shuffle, is so well done and it's so fun once you set it up correctly that I can tell you, I've set up a couple of wallpaper sets with Zelda and Ginger, my dogs, and I really like that. Every time I pick up my iPhone, I see a different photo of them, and it makes me smile every single time.
That's really nice. I have not actually tried the shuffle thing yet. I have been, there's also suggested photos, and it's in those categories that you just mentioned that you see the suggestions. And these are amazing suggestions. I mean, they're great pictures of my kids. There's pictures of, downtown Chicago and landscapes and all sorts of different things that look really terrific. And I've made a few with those. And I also like the gradient colors. I think those look particularly good. But I've got to try out the shuffle because that sounds like a great way to do this. There's a surprising amount of customization that you can do here. I mean, it's really remarkable how many different things from the fonts and the colors and the photos and the widgets that you can already customize. And this fall, we'll have third-party widgets as well.
Mm-hmm. And you've played around, I've seen screenshots from you. You've played around with the depth effect.
I have, yes.
Yeah. So can you tell me how that works? Because I still haven't seen a good suggested photo that works well with that effect on my end.
Yeah, this is interesting. And it's worth noting that you do not have to have taken a portrait mode photo for this to work. So, for instance, I posted one on Twitter a few days ago of the Chicago Sears Tower. At least that's what it used to be called. And what it does is the machine learning basically picks out the subject of the photo, the outline of it, and it will overlap the subject on a part of the time, giving you this kind of depth effect for your wallpaper. Now, it doesn't do it with every photo. It's interesting. I was just, as you were talking, I was just playing around, and I found a picture of one of my kids, for instance, wearing a baseball hat. And the baseball hat was under the time. It did not actually overlap in that circumstance, which is interesting because it's a pretty clear color and line differentiation to the background. So I'm not sure exactly when and why. Maybe that was a lower resolution, older photo, for instance, because it was when one of my kids was quite a bit younger. But I have found that the depth effect ones look really nice. The thing that's a downside of them, though, is that you lose the widget slots underneath the time, right? So there's 3 slots you can use underneath the time, and those disappear if you place even one widget in that slot, and instead the picture will be fully behind both the widgets and the time. And that makes sense, I think, given where the widgets are placed and that sort of thing. But I do like the depth effect so much that it's hard to decide, because I feel like I want more widgets even than the 3 that are available under the time to begin with, and to give them all up and only have one inline widget option at the very top of the screen is kind of a hard choice to make. But it's also so easy to make so many different wallpapers that you can make some of those and switch to them. But then if there's a day where you really need to have those widgets to know whether your package is coming and you want to see the weather and whatever else it happens to be, you can switch to that one just as easily.
Right. Yeah. And what I think is fascinating about having multiple wallpapers is that these different lock screens you can tie to focus modes and switch between them at different times of the day, depending on what you're doing. So this is, as I wrote in my story, this is the kind of feature that I plan on spending more time testing and understanding over the summer, if only because I don't really have the kinds of focus modes that Apple likes to advertise. Like, for example, a focus mode for when you're commuting to work, a focus mode for when you're actually at the office. Like, I don't have those focus modes, but you can, like, as you can imagine, you could set up, for example, a work lock screen that has a serious wallpaper, maybe with your company logo on it or something, and work-related widgets. And you could tie that because you can actually combine the lock screen and a home screen together in a focus mode, and maybe even an Apple Watch face. And so I think it's really interesting that now we have this system in place in iOS 16 where your iPhone can look different throughout the day based on what you're doing, based on where you are, as tied to a focus mode. So, and in addition to that, I should also mention that Focus in iOS 16 is getting this big update again, which is a surprise given that Focus is a relatively new feature. It came out last year.
Right.
And it's unusual for a brand new feature to get a sort of like this kind of revamp just a year later. But in iOS 16, there's a couple of things worth noting. The first one is it's much easier to put together a custom focus mode because now you have essentially an allow and deny list for notifications to silence alerts from people and apps. So now you can just say either allow all notifications from these people or silence notifications from these people. It's much easier than the previous system because, for example, you essentially you can make it behave either as an allow list or a deny list. There's a ton less fiddling than before in terms of picking settings and adjusting settings for the different focus modes. But also there's the new focus filters, right? So this is the ability for Focus to not only control notifications, but also control app content. So you can see, for example, in addition to silencing notifications for mail on your personal account when you are at work, now you can just say, don't show me my personal account when I'm at work. Or when I'm in my, freelance focus mode, show me just my freelance calendar. So it's basically calendar sets. So focus filters, thankfully, there's going to be an API for developers to implement this feature. And I think it's interesting because it shows that Focus is now going beyond notifications to actually deal with app content as well. And I think, there's some built-in examples for this. As I mentioned, mail accounts, calendar, tab groups in Safari can also be tied to a focus filter. So I want to spend more time with this because I don't have a ton of examples to share right now, but I want to see if there's maybe something that I can do on my end to take advantage of this feature.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that feature. I think it's really nice to see it improving and also to see it reach into apps because there's so many kinds of apps where you have different kinds of content, whether it's mail, calendar, Safari, or whatever. You have like oftentimes that's the work personal split, but there are other splits you could find as well that would work. So yeah, it's going to be neat to have that. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Collide. Collide is an endpoint security solution that uses the most powerful untapped resource in IT, end users. Old school device management tools like MDMs force disruptive agents onto employee devices that slow performance and treat privacy as an afterthought. Collide does things differently. Instead of forcing change on users, Collide notifies your team via Slack when their devices are insecure and gives them step-by-step instructions on how to solve the problem. By reaching out to employees via a friendly Slack message and educating them about company policies, Collide can help you build a culture in which everyone contributes to security because everyone understands how and why to do it. For IT admins, Collide provides a single dashboard that lets you monitor the security of your entire fleet, whether they're running on Mac, Windows, or Linux. That visibility makes it easy to prove compliance to your auditors, customers, and leadership. You can meet your compliance goals by putting users first. Visit collide.com/appstories to find out how. If you follow that link, they'll hook you up with a goodie bag, including a t-shirt, just for activating a free trial. That's KOLIDE.com/appstories. Our thanks to Collide for their support of the show.
So other features, other highlights in iOS 16 that I want to mention quickly. There's in Photos, you now have, we mentioned this on the lock screen, but also in Photos, you have the ability to lift the subject of any photo from the photo itself. It feels like magic the first time you do it. And as John mentioned, these photos don't need to be shot in portrait mode. iOS built-in intelligence can analyze a photo. If the subject is well separated from the background, you can just hold with your finger down on a photo and you will see this like magic outline appear across this all around the subject, and you can just drag and drop the subject of the photo, like say extract a dog from a photo and drop it elsewhere. Now, I don't know how useful this is in practice. I know that it's cool, it looks cool, and it's fun to lift the subjects off of photos and drop them in iMessage with friends.
That's all I've done so far.
Yeah, that's all I've done so far. I guess that it's potentially going to be useful if you drop that PNG in an image editor or something. But so far, I've only done it for the memes.
Yeah, I mean, I could see using it in something like Pages if you're doing some sort of multimedia type of document that you want to have something that's just an outline and have the text wrap around it, that sort of thing. It is really neat. It works basically the same way on the Mac, except on the Mac, since you're not holding with your finger, you're right clicking, and then you get the same sort of dynamic halo animation that outlines the subject and lets you copy it.
Notifications have been redesigned. Well, have been relocated, I guess. On the lock screen, notifications are now at the bottom. They roll in at the bottom of the screen. You can still swipe them up to open the full notification center, but the idea is that notifications now take up less space on the lock screen. And it's only obvious that Apple has done this because they want to put the focus on your wallpaper and widgets, right? They don't want to hide the beautiful lock screen that you've so carefully created for yourself. So now notifications, they roll in at the bottom, they stuck at the bottom of the screen. You can also, and I do this all the time, and I really love this feature, you can swipe them down to minimize them into this compact mode that just says, for example, 5 new notifications. It's just a badge mode, basically. It's a compact mode for your notifications. And of course, you can tap that indicator to return to the full design for notification banners stacked on top of each other. But it's really nice. I also want to mention other intelligence-related features. Mostly, I tweeted about this a few weeks ago. The system-wide support for unit and measurement conversion. And time zone conversion even. So anywhere you are in iOS 16, whether it's a unit like, I don't know, 20 feet or $50 in an iMessage, or something that you selected in text, say on Twitter or in notes or in mail, you will see built-in conversion for anything you can think of, either as a pop-up. So, for example, in iMessage, these data detectors will be underlined and you can tap them to see a pop-up with the conversion, or you will see the conversion in the copy and paste menu itself. The copy and paste menu is now called the edit menu, but that's the idea. If you select, for example, 10 a.m. Eastern, you will see a conversion for that time zone in the copy and paste menu. This feature is incredible. I love it. It's saving me a ton of time.
It's so good, yeah.
It's so good, especially with conversions for like Fahrenheit degrees for temperature, or time zones for times that I find on Twitter or that I receive in email. It's so good. I love it.
Yeah, iOS is really interesting, Federico. I'm a big fan of the lock screen. I have been playing with that a lot, and I think that those data detectors are really, really cool as well. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by SourceGraph. So you've hired a brilliant developer. That's great, but now you have to get them onboarded. If your company is growing, onboarding new developers will be a common occurrence, but it's a big undertaking every single time. One of the biggest challenges facing new hires is getting up to speed with the project their new team is working on. This can be tricky if the code base that your developers are working on are already large. Thankfully, SourceGraph makes it easy to move fast, even in those big code bases. Developers know that knowledge is most useful when it's findable. Centralization is helpful, but given the fact that most companies store knowledge in at least 2 different places, how do you make knowledge accessible to those who need it? As a code intelligence platform, SourceGraph gives developers what they need to drive their own learning over time and in different situations. Teams without SourceGraph need to rely on asking colleagues or reviewing out-of-date documentation, which is cumbersome and time-consuming. But with SourceGraph, every developer can search across millions of repositories to find specific code, saving time for themselves and everyone else, so that when questions do come up, you know it's the big stuff that's worthy of the extra time. SourceGraph was created to make developers' lives easier, and today they work with leading companies across every industry, including 3 out of 5 of the top tech companies, plus PayPal, Uber, Plaid, GE, Reddit, and Atlassian. Visit about.sourcegraph.com today to learn more. That's about.sourcegraph.com to find out why some of the biggest tech companies in the world use SourceGraph and to see what it can do for yours. Or just click on the link in the show notes to let them know that you heard about them from us. Our thanks to SourceGraph for their support of the show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about iPadOS? Because I think Stage Manager is going to be a big deal for everybody who's using an M1 iPad.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's a ton of other features in iOS that we don't have the time to cover today. But regardless, I've been thinking more about iPadOS 16 anyway over the past month. Because Stage Manager is really a big deal especially for people like me, for iPad Pro users like me, who have long wished, I think, for the iPad platform to offer something more, to go beyond what was possible with split view and slide over before. And that's possible now if you have an M1 enabled iPad Pro or one of the latest gen iPad Air models. So Stage Manager, first of all, it's a mode of iPadOS. Stage Manager does not replace split view, slide over, or the ability to use an application in full screen, the old-fashioned way, one app at a time. Stage Manager is an optional mode that you can activate either from settings or from Control Center. There's a brand new toggle in Control Center that lets you do that. Stage Manager, the idea is that it lets you use up to 4 apps in the foreground at a time. And obviously, using 4 apps at a time means those windows will overlap. So Stage Manager combines sort of the drag and drop based environment and the touch-friendly environment of the iPad with a windowing system that is obviously reminiscent of macOS. You have overlapping windows and you have resizable windows. You can resize those windows with from the corners or the vertical edge or the horizontal edge, just like on the Mac. But there are some key differences between Stage Manager and what you may be used to seeing on macOS. This is a point that I also highlighted in my story. With Stage Manager, Apple didn't just bring macOS windowing to iPadOS. They did something inspired by that, but also something that is new and different. So Stage Manager, first of all, it's called that because there's a central area of the screen called the stage. That's where you drop your windows. That's where you place your windows. You don't have to use multiple windows at a time. In fact, if you want, you can just place one window in the stage and use just that. But around the stage, there's a couple of UI elements. First of all, obviously at the bottom, there's your dock. And the dock behaves as usual. You can use it to switch between apps, and you can use it to drag and drop icons from the dock onto your stage, onto the workspace you're using. The first key difference between macOS and iPadOS is that if you're using Stage Manager and you have one window on screen, if you click another app in the dock, that window does not get added to your current workspace by default.
Right.
You're switching to another single app workspace. One of the key ideas, one of the key principles to understand about Stage Manager is that you have to be intentional about adding a window to your workspace. Meaning, to bring in a new window, you either have to use drag and drop, or meaning, you got to grab the icon from the dock or from Spotlight and drag it in, or you need to use the multitasking menu. The multitasking menu, the 3 dots at the top of an application window on iPad, has been redesigned in iPadOS 16. It now has icons and text labels, so it's easier to understand. It used to be just icons. Now, finally, it's got text labels as well. But there's also an add new window button there. So there's another way that doesn't involve drag and drop to bring in windows into Stage Manager. The other UI element is I believe it's officially, at least on Ventura, is called that. And I'm using that name in my article as well for iPadOS. So I'm gonna call it the strip.
Yes.
It's the recent apps strip. So this is
Federico, keep an eye on that setting in Ventura because it is one of the most bare bones setting screens I've seen on macOS in a while. And I wouldn't be surprised if that name changes.
So right now it's called the strip. Basically, it's a vertical list of your recently used workspaces. Now, I realize that this is the kind of feature where you need to see it to understand it. It doesn't lend itself well to a podcast, or in my case, also to a story with text. You got to see it.
Right.
But the idea is that you see on the iPad Pro in landscape, you see up to 4 recently used workspaces. These workspaces are window thumbnails with a live preview of the window that's in that workspace. But that's not all. In the strip, you will see a preview of these workspaces, including whether or not they are comprised of multiple windows. And the idea is that you can quickly alternate between these different workspaces on your iPad just by clicking one of the thumbnails on the left. And in addition to that, and I know that this is complex to understand on a podcast, but bear with me. There's a couple of extra things that you should know about the strip. The first one is you can also use drag and drop there. So you can grab a window from the strip, as I mentioned before, and intentionally bring it onto the stage and add it to your current workspace. So it also serves as a secondary dock, if you will. But also, the strip serves as a window picker as well. This is a new feature as of Public Beta 1 or Developer Beta 3 from last week. But you will see that in the strip, in addition to clicking window thumbnails, you can also click application icons. They are tiny, they are small, but you can click them. And if you do, clicking an application icon in the strip will basically filter the strip to show you just the windows for that particular app. So the idea is that the strip has your recent workspaces, but it also doubles as a window picker. Now, I personally like this, and it makes sense, I think, from a special perspective, but I can see how this gesture can be a bit hidden from users. There is a menu item to do this as well, but it's only available if you right-click on an icon and then you choose Show All Windows. So I think maybe the window picker will need a keyboard shortcut as well, or some better indicator for the fact that icons are clickable. But that's the gist of Stage Manager, right?
Yeah, it is. I should mention a few things about this that I like too, because I've been pretty impressed with this so far. I'll get into it more when I talk about Ventura, but it's a really interesting concept, mixing both Windows and apps in that strip and allowing them to be managed in one place. And I think it works pretty well. I mean, I think it's a really good first beta for that.
Yeah, I think so too. And the fact is, I think ultimately it's all about the question, does Stage Manager make you more productive?
Right. Can I ask you one thing about Stage Manager? Yeah. I want to ask you about the strip. And when you have, see, the thing is that those previews that are there on tilt in 3D, they're live previews. So if you have Twitter open and there's a GIF running in your timeline, you're going to see that out of the corner of your eye constantly. I'm kind of thinking that those should be static previews and not live previews. What do you think?
I don't know that I haven't really.
I see the utility of it, but have you seen that happen yet with something that's
No,
kind of moving a lot?
No, I haven't seen that happen on my end.
Yeah, well, at least on the Mac, they're live, and if I have like Twitter in the side there, and there's a GIF running constantly, one of those ads that are kind of blinky on Twitter, it will be there and bothering me. But I mean, that's a very small gripe.
Yeah, I gotta take a look at that because I haven't seen the moving GIFs on the strip. So I think for the past month, I can say that really Stage Manager has had a positive impact on how I work. And the thing is, and I also wrote this in my story today, it's funny, I think, coming from me, because I was also the guy who about a month ago wrote about how I disliked resizable and overlapping windows on macOS, right?
Right.
And the thing is, what I think Apple has done correctly here is, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, they didn't just take the macOS windowing system and slapped it on an iPad, but instead they modernized it and they tried to make it more intuitive. And I think this is possibly the most contentious point about Stage Manager at the moment, which is Stage Manager tries to manage the windows for you.
Right.
So on macOS, when you grab a window and you place it somewhere, it stays there and it doesn't move. And when you resize a window, it stays exactly like that. And if it covers something that is behind it, so be it. That's the way it is. There's a one-to-one match between what you do with the window and where it stays. That's what it looks like on the Mac. With Stage Manager, the system tries to make the workspace a bit more pleasant for you by subtly, and sometimes maybe not so subtly, adjusting the placements of windows for you to make sure that you can always see what's behind a window. I think it's very clear that Apple is trying to fix one of the, if not the biggest problem of macOS windowing, which is people tend to open a lot of windows and then they lose track of them and they end up with a mess and they don't know what's behind what anymore. There's a couple of ways that Apple is trying to address this problem. First of all, Stage Manager is limited to 4 windows at a time. As soon as you bring in a 5th window, the first one gets replaced by the new one. So you're always going to be limited to 4 windows at a time. There's also a performance consideration there because maybe the iPad cannot deal with 5 windows, or maybe the screen is not big enough, but that's a different conversation. So they try to limit the number of windows you have, but they also try to adjust and reflow basically the workspace for you. And I know that a lot of people don't like this. I know that a lot of macOS windowing purists are absolutely upset at this notion of the system taking something that you placed somewhere and moving it somewhere else, even by like half an inch or something. But for someone like me, that I've always disliked, carefully and precisely managing windows, I don't mind the system, and I actually kind of like it. And I was wondering what you think about this, John.
I actually like the way it's done myself, and I mean I get why people are upset about it, but I think it's really an enhancement that we don't have on the Mac. I mean, because as you mentioned, Stage Manager on Ventura, you can size those windows however you like, and you can put as many windows as you would like on a stage at once. Very quickly, once you get beyond those numbers that are allowed on the iPad, it's a self-defeating thing because you've got all of a sudden you've got a mess, and you got to kind of wonder why you're using Stage Manager in the first place. But on the iPad, that's just another thing that's controlled for you. And I think one of the benefits of a system like Stage Manager is going with the flow and going with the feature and letting it do for you what it's trying to do, because I think it's a benefit to a lot of people to have these things handled automatically without having to do them themselves. Now, I know that's really anathema to a lot of longtime Mac users who like to set up their screens exactly the way they want. I'm not one of those people. I'll talk about this more in a little bit, but I really love Stage Manager on the Mac because so much of the clutter that accrues on your Mac as you work is just kind of gotten, put away by someone else, by the system, so that I don't have to deal with it. And on the iPad, that it's taken one step further because you don't lose track of your windows either. There are always going to be some portion of those windows poking out where you can get to it really easily.
Yeah, and something else I really love that I also mentioned in my story is that there's a new set of keyboard shortcuts to manage those windows as well. You can remove a window from Stage Manager. This is called minimizing a window. Basically, it goes back into the strip. That's Command M, like on the Mac. You can now close windows with the keyboard shortcut. It's Command W, like on macOS. Mm-hmm. If an app has multiple windows, you're going to close the window you're currently selected. Or if it's only got one window open, you're going to quit the app as well. But there's also Globe F. Now, Globe F is an interesting hotkey because when you are in Stage Manager and say you have a workspace and you have 3 or 4 different windows open, and some of them obviously are small, for example, I like to use Stage Manager with like Obsidian as a larger rectangular window and then a bunch of iPhone-sized windows next to it, like Timery or Twitter or iMessage, for example. And now, in fact, you can even use iPhone apps in a workspace with Stage Manager. And those are just going to float there. So iPhone-compatible apps, iPhone apps running in compatibility mode on iPad are going to float there in the stage alongside other iPad apps. But let's say that I'm in the workspace and I want to focus on Obsidian or any other app for a few minutes. But I don't want to, quote unquote, destroy the workspace, right? I don't want to remove Obsidian for the workspace and then go back into another workspace. No, I want to stay there, but I also need to focus. What I can do is I can press Globe F. That's going to zoom Obsidian to fit the screen, right? So it hides the strip, it hides the dock, it goes back into full screen mode. But then if I toggle Globe F again, Obsidian goes back to its previous window size, and I see the other apps on the stage again.
That works a lot like some of the window snapping apps that you have on the Mac, things like Magnet and Moom and those sorts of things, or even better, Touch Tool, where you can, once you maximize a window by dragging it towards, say, the top edge of the screen, when you drag it out again, it will return to its original size, which is really a nice feature.
There's a ton of other things to mention about iPadOS, but it's hard to do this when you're running out of time on a podcast. As I mentioned, external display support is also available here. It's been very buggy for me in this beta. I haven't really used it a ton, but the idea is that you can use Stage Manager on an external display now as well. So you're not forced to use display mirroring anymore. And the best part is, you can have 4 apps on your iPad and a different set of 4 other apps on the external display. So really, the iPad Pro can power up to 8 apps at the same time. And these are 8 foreground, currently active apps. These are not suspended apps. These are running in the foreground. So the iPad Pro has the power to run 8 of those apps at the same time, if you consider the external display. And you can move a window from the iPad to the external display and vice versa. Right now, you can't move an entire workspace from the iPad to the external display. And this is weird, but there's a way to do the opposite. There's a way to move a workspace from the display to the iPad. So this is one of the things that I would like Apple to fix this summer.
Right.
And then, we can mention the other desktop class features of iPadOS too, right? There's display scaling is now a thing. So just like on the Mac, you can now enable a more space setting that will scale the UI to be smaller, but you will fit more content on screen. It's ideal for Stage Manager, obviously, because yes, the UI is going to be more compact, more dense. Fonts are going to be smaller. Buttons are going to be smaller, but you're going to see more content at once. And that helps when you have multiple windows to deal with. We can mention customizable toolbars. I know this is a feature that John and I have wanted for ages. This classic Mac feature that we thought Apple was never going to do, but they did. And they brought customizable toolbars to iPadOS. There's a ton of enhancements for files. There's a brand new document menu to rename and share documents. Open and save file dialogues have been redesigned. You can now rename file extensions. We could mention the fact that shortcuts are much, much faster to use than before. They're so much faster when they're running, and they have a new look for entering text into alert boxes that also don't block the UI anymore. So you can have a shortcut alert in the middle of the screen, but keep interacting with the UI underneath it. We could mention the new design for the sidebar in Safari on the iPad. You can now expand your tab groups in the sidebar and see all the tabs belonging to a group right there within the Safari sidebar. There's so much more to cover here, but one final thing I will say is that with the power of hindsight, I understand now why last year Apple brought, what were they called? Center windows to iPadOS 15.
Right.
Those windows that opened in the center of your workspace now make a lot more sense in iPadOS 16 with Stage Manager. You can find examples of those in Notes, Mail, and I think a lot. So that would, I guess this is the final thing I will say about iPadOS. Now more than ever, with Stage Manager, if you are a developer of an iPad app and you haven't done the work over the past couple of years to really, starting with iPadOS 13, so 3 years ago, to support stuff like multi-window or sidebars or 3-column layouts or keyboard shortcuts or opening multiple windows from your app, if you haven't done that work, you're going to have a busy summer ahead of you, because Stage Manager, while it doesn't exactly require adoption from developers, I mean, you can use Stage Manager with Google Docs and YouTube, the worst examples of iPad apps, and it works. But apps that have a modern iPad experience are going to be so much nicer to use with Stage Manager.
Yeah, that's true. Other apps that haven't adopted those things really do stick out. Federico, we have a ton of system app changes coming both to iOS, iPadOS, and macOS. I think we ought to save those for another episode so that we can really do them justice, because I know in my story, I just hitting the highlights, I went through 9 different apps. So, there's a lot of ground to cover there, and that those 9 aren't even all of them. So I think let's move on to
it's
macOS.
Probably best if we're doing it for you, dear listeners. So we want to give those, we want to do those apps proper justice.
Yeah, and we've got a long summer ahead of us, and who knows, there might even be more features added down the road that we can talk about then too. So we'll save those. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Memberful. Memberful is the easiest way to sell memberships to your audience, used by the biggest creators on the web. Memberful handles the hard stuff so you can focus on what you do best while earning revenue quickly. If you're looking to add membership to your existing business, you want a solution that works with your existing technology, so you can launch a new revenue stream without rebuilding your entire tech stack. Memberful seamlessly integrates with the tools you already use, like WordPress, MailChimp, Discord, and lots more. Memberful maintains a full-featured GraphQL API, webhooks, and OAuth single sign-on to make it easy to integrate seamlessly with any stack. It also maintains a best-in-class WordPress plugin to add membership and content restriction to your website. Use a custom domain name so everything is fully branded under your name, and connect directly with Stripe for secure payments. Memberful can handle your transactional email too. Memberful has everything you need to run a membership program, including custom branding, gift subscriptions, Apple Pay, free and paid trials, private podcasts, in-house newsletters, referrals, and tons more. We've used Memberful for years for Club Mac Stories, and we absolutely love it. Get started with a free, no credit card required trial today by going to memberful.com/appstories. Again, that URL so they know you came from the show is memberful.com/appstories. Our thanks to Memberful for their support of the show. I want to start before we get to the specific macOS Ventura features to mention one thing that I've really been enjoying, which is right now I'm running macOS Ventura on my Mac Studio, and I've got it in Stage Manager. And I've got the iPad Pro in a Hoverbar Duo stand from 12th South also running in Stage Manager with universal control, allowing me to switch from one to the other with the same keyboard and trackpad, right?
Okay.
And this setup is fantastic because I was already doing the thing where when I had my iPad next to my Mac, if I wasn't using an app on the iPad, I had a page of nothing but widgets, so I could quickly, check the weather or maybe see something about the music that was playing or see my task manager or timery, whatever it happened to be. But now I can have those apps right there. Like right now, I've got Messages open and Carrot Weather, and it's kind of nice having that right there. And I can, it's a good solution for things like your calendar, Discord, Messages, Slack, a lot of things that can work in that setup. I have 4 things, Federico, that I want to tell you about on Ventura.
Before you do that, here's a fun challenge okay. For you for the next episode. You have to tell me what happens. Let's see. Let me go a bit crazy here. What happens if you enable Stage Manager on your Mac, but then also enable Sidecar on the iPad? And basically, what I want to understand.
That I've not tried.
What I want to understand is what happens if you enable Stage Manager on both, but then turn the iPad into Sidecar mode.
Yeah, that's interesting. I expect bad things are going to happen, probably. I've tried a bunch of weird configurations. All right, so what I'm going to talk to you about, though, is Stage Manager, Continuity Camera and Collaboration, and then Spotlight and System Settings. Now, Stage Manager, you've covered a lot of the ground already because there's a lot of similarities between the Mac and iPadOS. However, there are a lot of differences too. For instance, the strip on the side, it holds up to 6 recents. So whether that's just windows from a particular app or sets of apps, it's got 6 over there. And as we mentioned before, you can resize your windows however you want. You can even maximize your window to fill your entire screen, which covers the strip. But when you cover the strip disappears off to the left in a nice animation. But if you hover your cursor back over that left edge, the strip comes right back and you can use it. So you're not losing. I think a lot of people see Stage Manager and see a small window centered in the middle of a big screen and think, well, this is just a waste of space. I want to use every inch I've got available to me. But you can. You don't have to have everything crowded into the center with a lot of borders around it. You can do it any way you want. The thing is, though, what I find, what was a revelation to me about Stage Manager is that I realized I was dealing with desktop clutter in one of 2 ways. I was either maximizing windows like the Obsidian window, which as a text editor, if you do that, if you make it fill your whole 27-inch screen, you're going to have just big black bars on the side. There's a lot of border. You don't want it to, text when you're editing text to run edge to edge anyway. So I was either doing that to cover up all the mess, or I was giving up and starting a new space and dropping new apps into it to kind of give myself a temporary clean space to work. With Stage Manager, I don't have to do any of that because all of a sudden, the app I'm working on is the only app that's visible. And if I need more than that, I can drag something in just like you can do on the iPad. What's nice about it is that it's perfect for someone who uses a lot of apps, which I do. But the reality is I don't use a lot of apps all at once. I'm not constantly switching between 12 apps. I might have a particular task that takes 2 or 3, but it's rarely more than the 4, which just so happens to be the limit on the iPad. You don't have that limit on the Mac, but I've found that once you start getting beyond 4 or so, you're losing a lot of the benefits from Stage Manager anyway. So I really like kind of keeping to those same kind of limits, even though I'm not constrained to them. And it works really well. The other thing I guess I would mention too is that when you're in Stage Manager, your desktop icons by default disappear. You won't see them. I know it's disturbing, but they're still there. You're just not visible. And in fact, that's a feature that you can turn off. If you really want to see the clutter, you can see the clutter. You can also turn off the strip if you want to. Those things are both in settings. So those are, those things I think are good. You can get to those desktop apps just by clicking the desktop, which will automatically sweep all of your apps into the strip and just show you your desktop so you can grab something from there. I actually kind of like that. I think it's like a focus mode that you don't have to set up yourself. And I've been really happy with it.
All this is just making me curious to install Ventura and try Stage Manager myself.
Yeah. It's wow. I've been surprised because I guess I went into this thinking, well, this is the solution for the iPad for windowing, and that's obviously going to be where it really makes a huge difference. And in reality, I do like it on the iPad a lot, but I've been really surprised at how much I like it on the Mac. It's really, as I described in the story, it's gone from something that I had to be running in order to test it to something I want to have running because I want to use it all the time.
Got it.
So it's that kind of thing. All right, moving on to continuity and collaboration. Continuity camera is an interesting feature. It allows you to use your iPhone's camera. It's anything that's an iPhone XR or newer as a webcam. And it's one of those Apple features that is wonderful because it works so well, even in the betas, where all you need to do is bring your phone close to your Mac. And if they both have, if they're both on the same Wi-Fi network and Bluetooth is turned on, it will automatically be available. And if you're, for instance, if I'm sitting here right now with my iPhone in my pocket, it's going to be available to be a webcam if I want to. I can open up FaceTime and I can switch to it right away. However, if I take it out of my pocket and I put it in landscape mode in a stationary position where it's not moving, in a stand or whatever, it will by default switch to that camera. And it'll be immediately available in FaceTime, Zoom, whatever you're using. QuickTime works with that as well. It's a really neat feature, and you have the option to use the microphone. You don't have to, the microphone of the iPhone, and it looks really good. I mean, because for most people, it's the best camera that they have available. And so there's, I tested, one of the things I tested, which is kind of cool, is a pre-production mount, a MagSafe mount that Belkin is coming out with later this year. Yeah, it was really neat. I got my hands on one of those, and it's a really low profile disc that attaches to the back of your iPhone by MagSafe, and it has two little pop-out pieces on the back. One is a small rubberized or plasticized hook that you can hook on the monitor of a laptop, whether it's MacBook Air, MacBook Pro, whatever. The other is a hinged piece that you can use as a stand so you can put your phone on your desk in landscape mode and just use it for watching YouTube videos or whatever. What I've been impressed about with it, and it's not the final version necessarily, but it holds on really well. It works well on the laptop, but it also is such a low profile that you can kind of keep it on there. So if you're someone who is moving through your day, walking around an office with a laptop and has a lot of meetings, some of the people happen to be on video every single time, you can just keep this thing attached to your phone, hook it to your laptop, and get going. I mean, it's all automatic and very easy to use. So I've been really, really impressed with it. I will say though that two things. One is when you hook it onto the screen of a MacBook Air, at least, which is the laptop I have, if you tilt the screen too far back and you've got a 13 Pro Max with a leather case on it, as well as this MagSafe mount, it starts tugging on that screen and pulling it back a little bit. But it's not as big a deal as you would think, only because I've found that the angle that you really want in that situation is closer to 90 degrees than leaning back in any event. Because, nobody likes that up the nose shot that you have on the webcam. So keeping it more at 90 degrees and elevating it a little bit is a better solution in any event. The other feature that's enabled by continuity camera is Desk View, which is a separate app that you can activate from Control Center or on its own. And it uses the wide angle and lens to create a view of your desktop. So you've got the camera, mounted on the edge of your laptop. And so you can both see your face and what's directly in front of you. Now, in these betas, I will say that I found you had to push the laptop back on the desk further than I thought was normal or natural in order to get a view of your desk and not your lap. But it does work, and it's kind of interesting. I do think, though, that maybe it's one of those features that's more of a good tech demo than something that a lot of people will use. I don't know when I would use it, but you could see demonstrating something with small objects or something in front of you where it might come in handy.
Yeah.
All right, moving on, Federico, I'm going to give you 2 brief updates on Spotlight and system settings. Spotlight's been improved. It's been redesigned a little bit. It's got a lot more information available. It does finally search your photo library and can search based on the metadata that that Photos has been collecting through machine learning for a while. So you can type in, dog, and it'll find pictures of dogs. It also works with live text. So to test it, I typed in the word yield and found a photo of a yield sign that came up.
Sure. Why not?
So why not? It will find photos on the web. It's got more deep information about certain topics like musicians, TV shows, movies, businesses, and sports teams. There are these other quick actions too that are available. I haven't seen very many of them yet in the beta. For instance, I know one of the demos is that you can create a timer because there's a new clock app in Ventura, and you can create a timer by using Spotlight. That's available. That rich information about things like movies that I told you about. It'll have all kinds of things. It'll have, bios and social profiles and discographies and artwork. And for sports, it'll have highlights, and businesses, it'll have links to, little mini previews of maps that you can click on and go straight to the Maps app. It's pretty nice. I mean, I don't think for me it'll be something that replaces a third-party launcher like Raycast or Alfred or something, but I might actually set it up right alongside those for times when I want to do things like search photos, for instance, because I think photo searching without having to open the Photos app is a pretty nice feature to be able to use. The final thing I'm going to mention, I guess, is one that I think has stirred up some controversy on the web. As the web, everybody on the internet likes to have a little controversy, which is system settings, which is the new system preferences. System preferences has been changed entirely. It was a static size window with icons that you would drill down into and change various settings, right? And there were too many settings in there. It was hard to find things, and I always found it a little confusing. The new version is a lot more like iOS and iPadOS. There's a sidebar and a main view part of the window as well. You select a category on the left. You have your options on the right, which is very simple and easy to use. I think it needs additional work in that I do find it a little overwhelming and maybe a little cluttered at the moment. I'm not as concerned about it though, because one thing that is better than system preferences is the search. And I've found that the search makes it very easy to find what I'm looking for. So, there's just no reason to try to guess where the engineers put this obscure setting when you can go up to the search box and type it and find it, right? So as much as I can't disagree with some people that say it's a little hard to find things if you're hunting and pecking. You don't have to hunt and peck though. So it doesn't really bother me that much. That said, I do expect that this is one area where we might see some changes over the summer.
Got it. Yeah, I think it looks much better than before. As someone who's mostly used to iOS and iPadOS, I think that's one of the things that I'm actually excited to try out, because I never can find anything in system preferences on the Mac. So.
Right. And it's, I think on the iPhone and the iPad, there's the same problem where sometimes you just forget where are the VPN settings or where are the developer profiles or something something that's in a weird spot. Sometimes it's in iCloud, or sometimes it's in security, or it's in general. And it's sometimes hard to find those things, but I think with good search, it really makes a difference. And I think it's an improvement myself. The name system settings is kind of interesting because it's just settings on the iPhone and the iPad. Yeah. I think keeping the system in there makes sense, though, because a lot of people have muscle memory of finding.
Yeah, they're going to search for it. Yeah,
exactly. So there's muscle memory involved with what system preferences was before on macOS. And things don't. We're not. The same people who complain that the Mac is turning into the iPad are now complaining about the fact that the names aren't identical, and I don't really get that. But they don't have to be the same. They really don't. It's close enough, and I think it's familiar enough to people who are coming from the other platforms that it'll be an improvement for those folks at least.
Yeah.
All right, Federico, that's been a lot. That's a lot.
And I feel like we barely scratched the surface.
I know. I have so much more to tell you about with Ventura. But we'll be doing that all summer long. That's what the Summer OS Preview Series is about. We're going to have a series of articles on the website. We're also going to have more episodes here on App Stories, all sponsored by Concepts, the Infinite Canvas app. So, just check back in from time to time. We're going to have lots of things to share all summer long. All right, Federico, I guess that's it for today. I want to thank those 4 sponsors again. That's Concepts, Collide, SourceGraph, and Memberful. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. If you want to get longer episodes of this show that are usually published a day early, but not this week because we had an embargo to honor, you can subscribe to App Stories Plus, which is at appstories.plus. Those episodes come out on Sundays, as I said. They're ad-free, and they're in high bitrate audio. You can find Federico on Instagram and on Twitter, where he's at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm on both as at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.